Hello and welcome to the Global Church Project. I'm Graham Hill. Andrew Sloane is lecturer in Old Testament and Christian thought and Director of Postgraduate Studies at Morling College in Sydney, Australia. He studied medicine at the University of New South Wales and practiced briefly as a doctor before training for Baptist ministry at Morling College, from which he graduated with a Doctor of Theology in Philosophy and Old Testament Studies. Andrew was ordained as a Baptist minister in 1991 and ministered in Sydney and Newcastle before joining the faculty at Ridley Anglican College in Melbourne. Andrew joined the faculty of Morling College in 2002 and has published in Old Testament and Hermeneutics, Ethics and Philosophy, and Theology. His most recent book is Vulnerability and Care, Christian Reflections on the Philosophy of Medicine. Andrew Sloane, thank you for joining us at Thinking Theologically.
You're welcome.
You're a senior lecturer in Old Testament and Christian thought and Director of Postgraduate Studies at Morling Baptist Theological College in Sydney. What are you working on at the moment?
So I'm working on a book on thinking Christianly about medicine, so trying to work on the philosophy and theology of medicine. I've called it, for what it's worth, Vulnerability and Care.
Who on earth would be interested in that?
Well, I am, and I hope a bunch of doctors will be too. I'm writing it primarily with doctors in mind. Doctors tend to be fairly pragmatic in their approach, which isn't a bad thing. Most people who go into medicine go into it because they want to make a difference to the world and to people's lives. And so sometimes they can be a little bit impatient about thinking through what it is they're doing and why. And I want to try and prompt them to do that kind of thinking.
Now you have particular expertise or background in both medicine and theology. Can you describe some of that background for us so we've got a sense of where you're coming from in this study?
Sure. So my medical background is in the distant past now. So I initially trained as a doctor and worked in total for 2 years in medicine. So I don't have a lot of clinical experience. Well, I suppose my personal experience in medicine goes back as long as I've been alive. My dad was a surgeon. So I grew up, and my mum was a nurse for that matter, so I grew up in a medical household, aware of these questions, being immersed in something of the culture. But my personal experience, as I said, is grounded in my training and brief practice as a doctor. But a sustained interest in medicine since leaving it. So having finished medical training and my work in medicine, I then studied for the ministry, being prepared for Baptist pastoring and then going on doing postgraduate work. And the postgraduate work really set the scene for the kinds of things I'm interested in, which is how we as Christians can engage in the world from a Christian point of view, and particularly how we can engage in various disciplines, particularly as they're related to university life and university education.
Now, in our discussion today, we'll be using the terms theology, philosophy, and medicine.
Yep.
I'll ask you a big question now. Are you able to give a concise definition of those three terms and give us a sense about how they relate to each other?
Sure.
That's a very big question.
It is. So philosophy, I think quite simply, is thinking carefully and critically about things that matter. That's it. There are a whole lot of fairly technical discussions of what's included, what's not included, a whole lot of terms. That's all very useful. But it seems to me that philosophy is, in the end, just thinking carefully and critically about things that matter. So philosophy of medicine is thinking about this thing because I think it matters. Theology, in many respects, sounds a bit like theology because I think theology is a matter of thinking carefully and thinking critically about things that matter, but doing so as Christians, and particularly in light of the scriptures, which is our primary authority, in light of the person of Jesus and what he's done, who's the centre of our faith, and in light of the tradition which helps us understand and articulate it and has given us many good examples of how to go about thinking about the world and engaging in it. Medicine, well, medicine's a bit harder to define in lots of ways, I think. I think there's if you like, a normative description, but we might come back to that. Medicine is a practice that people engage in order to deal with the kinds of needs that people experience that are thrown up by their life in the world when something goes wrong with their either physical or psychological functioning. That's basically what medicine's about, I think.
Now, I imagine that the field of bioethics have attempted to deal with some of the issues you're talking about. What do you see as some of the limitations of bioethics, and how does your study try to deal with some of those limitations?
So bioethics tends to think fairly specifically about particular dilemmas or problem areas or about medical ethics. Bioethics and medical ethics are slightly different, but for our purposes, they have a similar kind of focus, and that is they deal with questions like what kind of treatment ought we to provide to this person? Is it appropriate to engage in practices such as euthanasia? When, if ever, is abortion appropriate? What about reproductive technology? So they tend to focus on particular questions. Now, that's useful because if we want to be responsible in how we engage in the world, then we need to think about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. It has tended, however, to focus on dilemmas. That is, here's a particular problematic decision that someone is confronted with. Bioethics has tended to focus on those kinds of questions. Now, there has been something of a reaction against that, so people are now thinking more in character terms, that is, what kind of life do we live and how does that inform us? The recovery of virtue ethics has been quite interesting in bioethics. But even that, in my view, has rarely asked in a sustained way what I think are fundamental questions. If we want to know, is this an appropriate use of medicine, for example, then it seems to me helpful to know what medicine is, what it should be, and what medicine is for, the kinds of things it ought to be doing. Because very often dealing with those questions will give us either the answers that we need or the crucial perspective that we need to answer some of those tricky questions.
We often think about medicine being about health and healing and the alleviation of suffering. And I think you suggest in your study that this isn't the best way, the fullest way to think about the goals or the activities of medicine. Can you describe what you mean there?
Sure. So there have been a whole lot of discussions about medicine. There's been quite a bit of work done from a Christian perspective relating to questions of medicine, and very often that's been controlled by the category of healing. Sometimes merging that with ideas such as shalom, that is the fully functioning well-being of humans in community. Now that seems problematic to me for a number of reasons. One is it's difficult to define health and therefore healing. It's the kind of thing like time, which we know until we're asked to define it precisely. We all know what time is. We know about the passage of time. We know what health is, but try and define what counts as health and what isn't health, and you start coming into problems. Now, that's okay for what we do most of the time. That kind of general and vague term is quite helpful. But if we're thinking about what medicine is and what it's for, then we need to try and get a bit clearer, a clearer idea of what we mean. The problem with health is either it becomes very narrowly defined, so it's purely understood in terms of biological functioning, or it's defined very broadly, so that in effect nothing is excluded from health. And the danger with that is medicine can become an imperialistic enterprise, so that it kind of controls all of our lives. And I don't think we want that. Doctors do good and helpful things, but we don't want them to run our lives. So there are some of those conceptual issues that I think haven't been adequately addressed. But even if we had a clear idea of health or healing, it doesn't quite capture what medicine's about. Largely because There are too many things that have too great an impact on our health which have nothing to do with medicine. The most important things for an individual's health or the health of a community are not their relationship with their doctor or the medicines that they take or the medical programs they're part of, but it's things like, do they have access to clean water, to clean air, to good, safe food, to good, safe housing? Is there social security and stability in the communities in which they live? What are the kinds of relationships that they find around them? They are the most important determiners of an individual's health and the health of a community. Most of those things have got very little to do with what doctors are supposed to be about. So there's too much that relates to health that doesn't relate to medicine. Secondly, there's too much that relates to medicine that can't be understood straightforwardly as being about health or healing, and some really important things. So it seems to me that one of the most important times in a person's life when they're going to be engaging with the medical profession is when they're dying. Now, if you think about it for a moment, if someone is clearly dying and they know it and everyone around them knows it and their doctor knows it, then healing cannot be the goal of that engagement. It cannot be what that encounter between the doctor and their patient is about. And yet, to say that is not medicine strikes me as foolishness. So these crucial aspects of medicine don't relate to healing. These crucial aspects of health and healing don't relate to medicine. That doesn't quite seem to capture it. Even the alleviation of suffering doesn't necessarily do it, because there's a whole bunch of things that doctors do that have very little to do with suffering. Some of us, thankfully I don't, but lots of people in our community have to deal with issues of, say, high blood pressure or diabetes or such like. When they're being treated, people with high blood pressure aren't suffering at all. It's not about alleviating their suffering. It's not even about their healing, really. This is about putting some kind of intervention in place which might forestall some possible effects down the line. So again, health, healing, alleviation of suffering doesn't quite capture what medicine's about.
How does theology help us understand the purposes and activities of medicine?
Well, I think a key thing in understanding medicine is to recognise that it's a function of a well-ordered community. So medicine doesn't exist in isolation. It's a very complicated enterprise. In the Western world, it's a very expensive enterprise. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It involves a whole lot of things. Medicine as we currently know it can't operate with a whole lot of other social services which just cluster around it. So medicine is something that a community engages in. And I would suggest that medicine is something a community engages in order to deal with the kinds of vulnerabilities that people experience who are members of their community. Now, key question that theology asks is, what is the nature of humanity? What's the nature of human community? What does a properly functioning human community look like? That's a key question in theology. If you go back from the beginning in the creation narratives, we have a particular picture of human community. If you look at the end of the story, in the new heavens and the new earth, we have a new community. Those pictures of community give us some idea of what it is that God's about in the world, in God's engagement with humanity, and gives us some idea of what we ought to be about as we're engaging as faithful people in the community. Now, all of that, I think, gives us crucial theological background to then locate medicine within the functioning of a good community and to help us figure out what kinds of things in medicine should be doing and how we should think about it.
You said that health is difficult to define. How does theology give us any handles on what health might look like?
Yeah, one of the best treatments. Now, I'm still not satisfied with health as the governing term for medicine, and I'm still of the view that there's no tight definition of medicine. It's a fuzzy concept. But fuzzy concepts can nonetheless be useful so long as we recognise the limitations. The best treatment of that is in a book by a guy called Neil Messer called Flourishing. And he develops explicitly a theology of health. And he does it quite interestingly. And he explicitly recognises those dangers I mentioned earlier about limiting it just to biological functioning or extending it so that it covers the whole of human life. And what he suggests is that, drawing from Karl Barth, fairly significant name in 20th century theology, drawing on him, he argues that health is best understood as the strength to be human, which he then unpacks as health being that which enables us to flourish as human beings, the kinds of creatures we are in the contexts that God would have us be in, to flourish in those communities. Now, that I think, that notion of health and its connection to flourishing is very important, and that's very helpful. I think it contributes significantly to our understanding, but again, it doesn't quite capture it because of my prior problems with the notion of health and how it might function.
Are there some other thinkers that have influenced your thought, and what kinds of things do they say?
Yeah, quite a few.
Could hope so.
Yes, well, I mean, I could be glib and say, well, Jesus. Although, actually, that's a more complicated thing than you might think. We tend to think that there's a whole lot of stuff in the New Testament that relates to, that might be related to medicine, and kind of isn't. I think most of the healing stories that we find in the Gospels are telling us primarily who Jesus is and what Jesus is about. They're not there to give us an understanding of medicine. That's a pretty obvious thing to say, but some people forget that. I think that's unhelpful. But I think Jesus does give us an understanding of the kinds of goals that we ought to be pursuing. So it's a glib answer, but nonetheless, I think I'll probably stand by it. In terms of the theological tradition, probably the most recent, most interesting thinker would be a guy called Stanley Hauerwas. He's had quite a significant influence in Christian ethics, particularly in the Anabaptist tradition, and he's had some very interesting things to say about medicine, particularly the ways in which the loss of a story of the world, a story of ourselves, and of the necessary limits to the human condition that that story reveals to us, has led to medicine and the Western societies in which it's practiced being corrupted, would be a term that he would use. And I think there's some very helpful things in Hauerwas, as is generally the case. I think there are particular aspects of both his analysis and his solution that I think are problematic, but very, very insightful. There's another guy, quite a recent fellow, he hasn't written a lot, and he writes from a very interesting perspective, a guy called Geoffrey Bishop, who draws on the work of Michel Foucault, who's a complicated and puzzling figure, but nonetheless has some very interesting, very sharp critical analyses of the ways in which medicine has been co-opted by particular understandings of human autonomy, particular understandings of control over human affairs, and the ways in which medicine has become a way of exercising what he calls disciplinary power. And again, I think they expose some of the things that have been going wrong in medicine, and some of the things that as Christians we ought to be deeply concerned about.
So we'll get to one of the pointy ends. What do you think medicine is, and what do you think medicine is for? So
I think medicine is primarily a community's expression of care, its solidarity with members of its community whose weakness, vulnerability and frailty has been exposed by something that they've come up against in their life, either some kind of infirmity or disease or illness, something that has disrupted their physical or psychological functioning. Medicine is a way of a community, if you like, embracing those people rather than abandoning them in their need. That's basically what it is. And in that sense, medicine clearly has fuzzy boundaries. It overlaps with a whole bunch of other things that communities would do in order to help those who are vulnerable in their midst. Nonetheless, I think that's at the very heart of it. And as Christians, I think that's something we ought to be passionately concerned about. And that way of thinking about it, I think, lines up very clearly with the fundamental features of the Christian story.
How does thinking about medicine help us do theology?
Well, I think medicine raises questions that otherwise theologians might forget. So when we're thinking, for instance, about a fundamental category like shalom, which I think is a kind of governing idea, it helps us see what human existence is meant to look like. Thinking about medicine helps us understand particular aspects of the disruption of shalom. And if we're doing theology, if we're thinking carefully and critically as Christians from the perspective of the scriptures, from the perspective of the gospel of Jesus, from the perspective of the tradition, then thinking about those things that go wrong in human flourishing matters theologically. Mustn't neglect it. But also might challenge some of our theological categories. We can, I think, be a little too glib, for instance, in our understanding of the character of flourishing. So one of the things that Mess is particularly clear about is the way that disability forces us to think differently theologically, because we tend to think, if you like, of how can I put this, of able-bodied normativity, which is okay as far as it goes, but then we don't think, what does it look like for someone who's born blind to flourish? What does it look like for someone who has a spinal injury and is now paraplegic or quadriplegic? What does it look like for them to flourish? And what patterns of community do we need to put in place to ensure that they can flourish as much as they can? Clearly that flourishing isn't going to be expressed in standard bodily form, but nonetheless, not only can they flourish, but they can contribute to the flourishing of our communities. That, it seems, is really important. Or when you think about people who are dying. Now, the theological tradition has lots and lots and lots of really interesting resources on the art of dying well, which really is a matter of shaping our lives with a sharp awareness of our own mortality. But that's something I think that our culture and our churches have veiled from view. Medicine, with its engagement with people who are dying, who are facing the inevitability of their finitude, the inevitability of the decay of their bodies, which is something that we will all face, force us to reflect theologically again about death and dying, and both the shadows and lights that casts on what it means to live well.
Does it also help us think a bit more about the nature of community and the role of community?
Absolutely. If medicine is an expression of a properly formed community's care for its members, then clearly we need to do a bit more thinking about what kinds of care ought we to provide to the vulnerable in our midst. Because medicine is just one of those forms of care. And if it were the only form that our care for the vulnerable took, then ours would be deeply impoverished communities, rich as medicine might be. Because, again, for vulnerable people, things like economic systems, social structures, even transport infrastructure, those things can be absolutely crucial to whether they can live well or not. It's not that thinking about medicine gives us answers to those questions, but thinking theologically about medicine prompts us to ask a range of questions that we might otherwise forget.
Is there anything else that you want to share with us on this topic today?
Not without giving you the whole book, I suppose. Look, the key thing, I think, is one thing I think theology has neglected at times is its responsibility to be a servant of the church. or if it's not forgotten that, it's thought of the church far too narrowly. So it's thought of the church as gathered, or perhaps thought of the church as it's engaged in what can be clearly seen as a missional activity. Theology has tended not to think well, hard and long about what it is for the church scattered to engage Christianly in the various fields in which people find themselves. There's not been a lot of good reflection on what does it mean to be a Christian doctor. Some of the standard answers I find offensively reductionist, in fact. And these are even answers that good and faithful Christian doctors have come up with. Things like, well, our job is to evangelise our patients and our colleagues when we can. I guess to contribute to people and their physical needs, and to make money to support ministry. That strikes me as offensively impoverished. Because if our story is the story of a God who made the world and who is bringing it to its fulfillment and fullness through the midst of brokenness and sin, then it seems to me that medicine has a really important role to play, and Christians have a really important role to play in thinking about what it is. That perhaps it's not just that we're being kind to people, but perhaps that engaging in medicine well is one of the signs and foretastes of the kingdom that we are called to manifest. That thinking about the institutional frameworks in which that operates, the kinds of values that they embody, that's an expression of the kingdom of God, that we can think about how might that glorious goal towards which we are heading be reflected even in the patterns of social arrangements. But there's a lot more I could say, but I think that'll probably do for now.
Andrew Sloane, thank you for joining us and thinking theologically.
Thank you very much, Graham.
The Global Church Project is located at www.theglobalchurchproject.com. On our website you'll find a wide range of interviews and resources for colleges, universities and churches. I look forward to your company next time. From me, goodbye.